Welcome to the overview of the book of Zephaniah. Zephaniah is one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. His name means Yahweh hides, or Yahweh has hidden, or Yahweh treasured. Names are important in the Bible. There are always significant meanings attached to them. The meaning of Zephaniah could be referring to God's protection of his people during the difficulties in Zephaniah's day. We're not told much about Zephaniah, but are given the names of his ancestors to the fourth generation. With this information, we do know that he was a man of prominence and even royalty. He was the great-great-grandson of King Hezekiah of Judah. He is the only known Old Testament prophet with such high social standing. This would have also made him a distant relative to King Josiah, who was ruling at the time of this prophecy. He was probably a resident of Jerusalem because of his familiarity with the city that is described in the book. And we see some of these descriptions in the first chapter, verses 10 and 11. Since Zephaniah prophesied during the reign of Josiah, it is believed that it was written between 622 BC and 612 BC. He ministered about a half century after the prophet Nahum. As with the other Old Testament prophets, Zephaniah prophesied against Judah's persistent disobedience and immorality, especially those who were in positions of leadership. In his prophecy, he denounced the idolatry, materialism, and greed that exploited the poor. Social injustice was widespread, and wealth was enjoyed by some through oppressing the poor. He announced God's judgment on Judah and the surrounding nations for their sin. And we see this in chapter 1, verse 17. In Zephaniah, we see him announcing the coming day of the Lord, which was a coming disaster for Judah and the nations. This is a major emphasis of the book. In fact, he uses the expression, the day of the Lord, more than any other Old Testament prophet. Concerning the coming day of the Lord, he referred to it as being near, as a day of wrath, distress, and anguish. It will be a day of trouble, ruin, darkness, and gloom. The day of the Lord will be a day of doom. But his prophecy isn't without hope. The final chapter and a half describes how restoration will occur. Here's the basic outline of Zephaniah. First, the introduction, chapter 1, verse 1. We are introduced to Zephaniah. We learn of his heritage to the fourth generation, and we discover that he is the great-great-grandson of King Hezekiah. We also learn that he prophesied during the reign of King Josiah. The second section is the coming judgment of the Lord in chapter 1, verse 2, all the way to chapter 3 and verse 8. This is the major section of the book, and it addresses the judgment of God in several ways. There is universal judgment on all the earth in chapter 1, verse 2 and 3, and chapter 3 and verse 8. Zephaniah begins with a general warning to all of the earth. God is judge of the whole earth and especially of his people. There is judgment on Judah and Jerusalem in chapter 1, verse 4, all the way to chapter 2 and verse 3. Judah needed to know that we were not immune, or they were not immune from the judgment of God. Zephaniah announced that they were going to be judged because of their failure to obey and follow God. We see judgment on the surrounding Gentile nations in chapter 2, verses 4 through 15. This included Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Cush, and Assyria. And finally, Zephaniah returns his focus on Jerusalem and Judah. There's judgment on Jerusalem in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Jerusalem is charged with the failure to obey. She did not trust in the Lord, and she did not draw near to her God. She worshiped outwardly, but not inwardly. Finally, in the main section, section 3, there's the coming restoration of the Lord in chapter 3, verse 9 to verse 20. In the final section of this book, there is hope given in the fact that God will restore. There will be restoration for the nations, chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. The heart of the nations will be turned to God, and they will worship and serve him. There will be the restoration of Israel in chapter 3, verses 11 through 20. God will remove the proud from Jerusalem. There will be no more shame, pride, or fear in their midst. There will be no more deceit. Mount Zion will be made holy by the very presence of God. God's people will trust in their God and worship him. There will be rejoicing and great joy because God will be present with his people. Fear and sorrow will be removed, and the Lord will restore his people's fortune. The time of their judgment will be past, and their enemies will be conquered. In fact, God will find delight in his people. We see that in chapter 3, verse 17. Some things to look for as you read this book. First, the sovereignty of God. Because of Zephaniah's unique background as belonging to a royal family, he had opportunities to speak for God that others may not have had. The same is true for us. We may not be of royal bloodline, but God gives us unique opportunities to witness and to serve him because he controls every aspect of our lives. He places us right where we need to be to serve him. Be aware of these opportunities. Something else to look for is the justice of God. The judgment of God was not just on heathen nations. His judgment was also on his chosen people because they refused to obey him. While our sins are forgiven, those who have personally have a relationship with God, it doesn't mean that he overlooks or excuses sin in our lives. God is holy. He's a holy God. He cannot excuse or ignore sin. As his children, we are still called to come to him and to seek his forgiveness and forsake our sin. 1 John 1 and verse 9. Something else to look for is the grace of God in giving his warning to Judah through Zephaniah. This demonstrates that God's heart for his people was that they would turn from their sin and follow him. Unfortunately, they didn't. Do we appreciate and value the warnings that God gives us through his words over our sin? Do we heed his warning and take him serious? Another thing to look for is the faithfulness of God to his word. He's already given multiple warnings to his people for disobedience, all the way back to Moses. Yet Israel refused to listen and follow God's instructions, and it resulted in judgment. God is always faithful to his word. We can trust that God will do what he says he will do. This should bring confidence and hope, realizing that all of God's promises will be fulfilled. God has already told Israel that they would inherit the promised land, and all of their enemies would be destroyed. While this hasn't occurred, we know that it will in the future because God is faithful to his word. Are you encouraged and strengthened to obey God because of this truth? We serve a faithful God. As you read Zephaniah, I trust that you will be encouraged to see how God faithfully leads his people through his judgment of their sin and ultimately to their restoration.